The origins and beginning of World War II. When you're looking at the beginning origins of World War II, there are essentially 7 different causes, fundamental causes for the Second World War. Whether it was the Treaty of Versailles, the terms, especially the War Deal Clause and the reparations, the devastating effects of the Great Depression, especially with the collapse of the Western European currencies to the unemployment, the rise of Hitler, the 3 main failures of the League of Nations, fascism, totalitarianism governments, and extreme nationalistic governments. Remember, the 3 powers all had different opinions and goals, what they wanted from the League of Nations. The powers being France, Britain, and America, the victorious democracies at the end of the First World War, from the armistice, the Paris Peace Conference, and then the actual signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Originally on, the aims of the League of Nations was to discourage any more aggression between countries, to encourage cooperation between countries, encourage a policy of disarmament, while working to improve the working conditions for all people across the world. However, the League was located in Brussels, and while this was ultimately the only main point of Wilson's 14 points that were done, it did serve a purpose. But it did have some critical failures or weaknesses that had to be addressed now, as the League doesn't exist now, but it is called the United Nations. It's actually interesting looking at the map to see the countries that were part of the League of Nations originally on, from founding member countries like Canada, Bolivia, Australia, New Zealand, China, India, France, Britain, founding member, to countries that were founding members but left and joined again, such as big portions of Africa, Newfoundland, Yugoslavia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Argentina even. Countries that joined later on and stayed until the League was formally dissolved, such as Abyssinia, Egypt. Countries left and joined later, or places actually were actual mandates for the League and the policy of decolonization and the way emancipation of the freedoms. And throughout the 1920s and the whole Roaring Twenties, the League's success had some success. They helped free over 400,000 prisoners of war. The World Health Committee, which is now the World Health Organization, but the World Health Committee worked hard to eliminate diseases such as leprosy, malaria, and people who were enslaved in certain colonies were set free. But one of the main problems with this, the League was not part of every country, as we saw on the previous map. And one of the main countries that was not a part of the League was the United States. Even though it was the American president, Woodrow Wilson, that came up with the idea in his 14 points, Wilson would actually lose the election, and so America never joined the League. It remained essentially a European exclusive club, which would prove to be very detrimental moving on. There was also the Wall Street crash, where members of the League turned their attention to their own domestic issues rather than looking at international concerns. There went Black Thursday with the stock market crash happening and the Great Depression that caused waves upon waves of unemployment across Western Europe as well as in North America. And the crash on Wall Street also heavily impacted on Japan, Imperial Japan, which even today relied heavily on international trade to sustain their overall business model. And the 1920s were good for the League. The Roaring Twenties, the 1930s, the Dirty 30s was bad. The 1930s was seen for bad for the League because there was 3 main failures for the League, and that was Imperial Japan of Manchuria, the failure of the Disarmament Conference, and the fascist Italy's invasion of Abyssinia in Africa. So the first failure was in Manchuria. It was a failure because Japan was originally part of the League of Nations, and it was a very valuable member because of its status. But it was a growing power, and there was an explosion on the Manchurian Railway, which the Japanese relied on heavily. Because of this explosion, China, which was in the middle of a civil war, appealed to the League for help, but Japan refused and continued to invade other areas around China. And while the League talked about sending sanctions, no troops actually were sent because they felt that Japan was too far away to be a problem. And the League needed Japan to be part of it as a form of credibility. But by criticizing Japan felt they had to leave the League because they had lost face. The second failure was the Disarmament Conference. Happened in February 1932 when the League had its long-awaited disarmament conference and tried to achieve global peace. And while there was resolutions that were decided upon how many artillery and tanks each country will have, no actual ways or mechanisms were put in place of how to actually enforce these rules. Additionally, no one could agree whether or not Germany should be forced to stay with the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles or be allowed to have the same level as well. It should be noted at the disarmament conference was when it was unveiled the alliance between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. And so this alliance essentially hijacked what was supposed to be the original intentions of the League and also the conference. Then came the third failure when Fascist Italy invaded Abyssinia. Abyssinia was the last of quote-unquote free places in Africa. Most of the rest of Africa was either a British or a French colony with some Italian territory. And while the fighting was actually pretty resistant towards the Italians, Italy took this because it would provide a serious tactical problem for the British. The Italians could essentially block off the Red Sea, so Britain couldn't use the Red Sea to access to colonies such as India and had to go all the way around Africa. The League of Nations did nothing about this, and actually countries such as Canada actually supported the use and the invasion of Abyssinia as a form of appeasement, like sacrifice Abyssinia in a way to try to preserve the peace that had been won in the Great War. So those were the failures. Who were the various leaders at the start of the conflict? Hitler and Mussolini would form the original Axis power. How did the Great Depression affect the economies of Europe is an important question to know and understand, along with what is a dictator is another important term you want to make sure you understand. Benito Mussolini was the leader of Fascist Italy. Mussolini's goals was that he wanted to rebuild the ancient Roman Empire. And to help achieve this, he formed an alliance with the Nazis called the Axis power. Mussolini is also known as the father of fascism, a super extreme right-wing ideology of hyper-nationalistic pride and feeling towards one's own country and people. And Mussolini also supported General Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Generally, this is the map of the territory Mussolini wanted Italy to have. Dark green was the original Italian territory, and the lighter green were territories they wanted to add. Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, survivor and veteran of the First War, wrote the book Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which is actually a book in 2 volumes that talks about actually what he wants and his plan to do it. He was anti-Semitic, but he was not born in Germany. He was actually born in a small town of Austria. It's been noted that he also painted only landscapes that had no people. And after the war, he tried to actually go into art, but was denied. He hated the Treaty of Versailles. He felt the government of Germany had betrayed the people, especially with the War Guilt Clause Article 231 and the reparations. And he wanted to create the Aryan race, this so-called master race, and the Third Reich that'll last for 1,000 years. But Hitler also thought that over 40% of people in Germany were unworthy of living. This indicates the territory that he wanted to have. This is definitely not unoccupied territory. There'd be a lot of people that would be displaced. William Lyon Mackenzie King was the Prime Minister of Canada throughout the 30s and during the war. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, communist, extreme left wing of the political ideology. And while he did not trust Hitler, he still signed the Nazi-Soviet pact for various reasons. But like Hitler, Stalin was not born in Russia. He was born in a small town in Georgia. He wrote love poems, but Stalin had many rounds of purges which decimated the whole military hierarchy and the military structure. He was paranoid to the absolute extreme there. We definitely want to remember what is communism and how it is and what does it mean to be on the extreme left wing of the political spectrum. We also want to understand why communism and fascism are diametrically opposed to each other, and it's more than just one is extreme left and the other is extreme right. General Franco, the leader of the fascists in Spain, and while he was supported by Hitler and Mussolini, and once he wins the government, Spain would remain neutral in the coming war. And Spain will he would remain years after the war in Europe was over. But he did overthrow a democratic government. But in Spain, there is the couple really important Canadian connections. And while Canada did not have an official stint in the Spanish Civil War, there was stories, one of them being Norman Bethune. Now, like I said, Canada did not have official involvement in the war, but the government did not stop Canadians who were, well, during the 30s, unemployed, riding the rails, going from soup kitchen to soup kitchen, did not stop those who wanted to go over to Spain to fight for the democratic government. And those who wanted to fight, they were part of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, or the MacPaps. And this is the picture of them fighting at the Battle of Belchite. It's kind of interesting, MacPap and Papineau, because those were the leaders of the rebellions in Canada in 1837. So it's an interesting historical connection. The second one, as I mentioned before, was Norman Bethune. And while his story is an interesting one, he was definitely involved in the Spanish Civil War. He's more known as the Canadian who joined the communists in China then. Even people in China today know him as the Canadian, the one who was part of it. In this bottom right image, you can always, if you see this, you can always see CCTV News as the Communist Party's news broadcasting. It's a very unique, very distinct style to it. General Tojo, Imperial Japan, the highest ranking military leader of the totalitarian government. To put it lightly, Japan's government was extremely complicated. For one reason, the god was the emperor. The Emperor Hirohito, was viewed as a living god. But Japan had combined the elements of European imperialism with former Japanese shogun stuff. Two very powerful militaristic styles there. So Japan was definitely, Imperial Japan was a growing power in the Pacific and East Asia theater. And by 1942, had reached the greatest height of their imperial power. Everything in red represents their territory for a time. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He was also the British Prime Minister during the First World War. It is interesting to note that sometimes for leaders, they can never be a leader in peace times. There are certain individuals that their, for lack of better words, their calling has to be at times of great conflict and strife. And so definitely Churchill was that. And while Churchill did protest loudly against Chamberlain's, the Prime Minister before him, policy of appeasement or the Munich Agreement, there he was ignored. But history has shown that he was correct, that the Munich Agreement would just empower the Nazis even further. Roosevelt was the President of the United States, and while he was wanting to have a more active role in the war, Congress would not support it until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The appeasement policy, the Munich Agreement, where Chamberlain thought he made a deal with the fascists, so basically Nazi Germany, to give the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia over to Nazi Germany. Chamberlain felt this deal would preserve the peace that had been won from the previous war, but Churchill rightly pointed out this has made the situation worse. This was part of the overall unification plan that the Nazis were doing to reunify all the former Germanic peoples and the territories they were taking bit by bit before the actual start of the war. And then the war begins with the official invasion of the Danzig corridor in Poland. What made the Nazis so effective early on in the war was that they had a tactic called Blitzkrieg, also known as Lightning War. The Blitzkrieg was basically broken up into 3 steps. First, was a heavy bombing campaign by the Luftwaffe from the sky. Then, swift tank movements, followed by sending the Wehrmacht, the army, the armed forces, in to mop it up. This was so effective, the mechanized swiftness of the war, and that in the span of a couple months, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands all fell to the Nazi Blitzkrieg. And the French fell into the Nazi trap, which eventually led to the fall of France. But unlike in the First World War, this time was different. Canadians were not eager to join in the war. Unlike in the First World War, where there was lots of volunteers for the Expeditionary Force, this time was different. There was definitely volunteers and enlistment, but everyone knew this is going to be different. As the Western Europe was falling, there was the miracle of Dunkirk, where it was definitely a propaganda heyday for the Nazis as the Allies left all their materials behind. But it was viewed as a miracle because so many soldiers were saved against either capture or destruction by the Wehrmacht. Many soldiers would escape. They crossed the English Channel so they can fight again on another day. France did fall. They actually made Paris a free city, so it was unopposed. And the Nazis took 2/3 of the country and left the bottom third as a puppet governed a protectorate called Vichy France. There was also the Battle of Britain, which was daily bombing raids against British cities and airfields. Hitler was trying to make Britain surrender, but it would never succeed because the various Commonwealth countries would band together and be part of the British Commonwealth training program, a program that we'll get over in a different topic, a different day in Canada, with the terms too for why, of Churchill's opinion, we shall never surrender. But in the Second World War, total war was different. Unlike World War One, total war meant society was like a wartime society, munitions, everyone had a role to play, but there was still a sad battleground somewhere else. In the Second World War, total war was different because yes, war society was a wartime society once again, but everything could be a battle. Cities, towns, building by buildings, room by room, even anything and everything could be a fair can be a battle size. Why World War II has such a horrendous death toll, and the death toll is actually higher not in soldiers, but it's actually in civilian casualties. There's also carpet bombing, where from planes just drop bombs by the thousands, and they're not targeting particular locations in general. They're just destroying, just outright destruction. Not the Soviet Pact, going back to this, right? Despite each other not like trusting each other, they agreed to this pact. Hitler wanted this pact so they could have a shared border to launch Operation Barbarossa, and Stalin agreed to it because wanting to have a shared border is a way to create a buffer between the communist country and the Western democracies. And I think too, Stalin figured Stalin probably didn't actually care who would win the war in Europe. He did not care whether the fascists would win or the democracies would win. He just wanted to share borders at once, whoever side ended up being victorious, then the communists would just come on through, the Red Army would come on through and conquer all of Europe. So, but Stalin did feel personally betrayed by Hitler once this pact was broken. With the Americans, as I said, they were not actively involved in the war until Pearl Harbor. They were not neutral. And one of the biggest contributions was the Lend-Lease Act. They may not be sending the people to fight, but they definitely were using their great industrial capacity to be the arsenal of democracy to supply the supplies, the tanks, the guns, the machines for the Allies' effort against the Axis powers. There was also the Atlantic Charter agreement between Churchill and Roosevelt, where, unlike World War One and World War Two, the Allies will have goals: the right for all people for self-determination, the right for speech, religion, want, freedom of fear. These were the stated goals why they were going to be fighting against the fascist powers, the Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And with changes to the type of ship, the new type of warship was the aircraft carrier. And even today, under modern warfare, the aircraft carrier is the epitome. This is the platform that projects a country's power beyond their exclusive zones. World War One, I really heralded the beginning of like battleships and the dreadnought. World War Two, well, those were important. What was more important was the aircraft carrier, and that still very much is the case today in the early 21st century. What did actually bring America eventually to war was the attack on Pearl Harbor. And last, the Battle of Hong Kong happened at the same time as Pearl Harbor. Imperial Japan and Britain were not technically at war, but Britain did not have any chance to defend Hong Kong, the territory that they had won back in the First Opium War nearly 100 years before. Canada offered to send troops to help defend Hong Kong, and so they sent the Royal Rifles of Canada, a regiment that was stationed in Newfoundland. Remember, Newfoundland was not Canadian at this point. Newfoundland was originally a dominion, but they had some mishandling of their economics, and so they were announced that their dominion status was revoked. So by the start of the Second World War, Newfoundland was once again a colony of Great Britain. But there were still very deep connections between Canada and Newfoundland. There. Topic will explain more in the next video. And Hong Kong served as a rallying cry, a banner to get the Canadian war effort underway. And that's the end for today.